From News Channel 8, this is News Talk with Bruce DePoint.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's good to have you with us today. It'll be 2016 before the Republicans running for president meet again on a debate stage. This week's encounter providing plenty for political junkies to chew on. With the Iowa caucuses coming next month, the race for the GOP nomination is intensifying despite the looming holidays. Tim Alberta is chief political correspondent for National Review, and he joins us now. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Bruce.
Happy holidays. Good to have you with us. There were a lot of interesting storylines coming out of this week's GOP debate in Las Vegas. One that is generating a lot of buzz in political circles was the clear rivalry between Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. The rivalry may not be new, but the way it sort of formed into a lasting split-screen image is one of the big dynamics right now, I think, in the chase for the GOP nomination.
Absolutely. For me, it was actually the single biggest takeaway from the entire evening. I remarked to a colleague of mine as the debate was in its closing moments, I said, you know, there were 9 people on that stage tonight, but during the most critical moments of the debate, there were only 2. And time after time after time, it was Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz on the split screen you referenced, and the rest of the candidates were bystanders on issues of national security and foreign intervention abroad, on issues of data collection here at home, on an issue of immigration, which was probably the single biggest blow up that we saw the entire night, the most fireworks, and that was an issue that we sort of expected to come up, and it certainly did, featuring those 2 as the chief combatants. They really went after each other, and that was not a surprise. It had sort of been building over the last couple of weeks, largely done remotely by press release going after one another, but it really came to a head on Tuesday night, and it was very entertaining for those who were in attendance.
They share some interesting historical or biographical, I guess you could say. They, they're similar in some ways. Their political caricature or characterization. Are they vying for the same political turf?
Not really. So it is interesting that they do share very similar biographies, personally and politically. They both sort of rose to prominence because of the Tea Party movement and channeled that frustration, that sort of outsider insurgency that was taking out one incumbent after another in Washington. Rubio, of course, elected in 2010 in Florida, and Cruz 2 years later in Texas, both huge underdogs in their respective campaigns. But when they came to Washington, they made some significantly different decisions as far as policy and as far as politics was concerned in terms of how they were going to sort of position themselves. Marco Rubio, who is ideologically very conservative, not quite as conservative as Ted Cruz, but still very conservative, sort of determined that he was going to sort of cozy up a little bit with the political establishment and try and take on a couple of big issues, immigration chief among them. Ted Cruz, of course, came to Washington with an agenda that was the exact opposite. He was there not to work with the establishment, but to blow up the establishment. And those 2 sort of found themselves on opposite sides of a number of issues, but again, none bigger than immigration, and it really is the defining issue in terms of their relationship. These are 2 guys who actually get along quite well. Their Senate staffs get along very well. They are personally very friendly with one another, but they have completely different perspectives on the issue of immigration, and that is going to be the #1 issue for them moving forward, especially as the field winnows and we find ourselves perhaps facing a binary situation with those 2 as the last 2 standing.
This week's debate in Las Vegas was the last debate we'll have this calendar year. We'll hit the holidays soon. We'll turn the page. We'll get into 2016 itself. And within a few weeks' time, they'll be caucusing in Iowa, and they will be voting in the first in the nation state to have a real primary event, the state of New Hampshire. It seemed like everyone on the stage in Las Vegas the other night had a good night, but if a Chris Christie or a Jeb Bush was looking to have a great night, to really ignite their candidacies in a way they hadn't up until now, I'm not sure anyone got that major league spark.
I'm not sure there was any breakout performance, I agree. You know, you have candidates like Jeb Bush, like Chris Christie, like John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, who have basically planted their flag in New Hampshire and who will acknowledge at this point that either they win in New Hampshire or they go home and their candidacy ends. And so I do think, especially in talking to some friends of mine in New Hampshire over the last week or so, some sources of mine who I saw in Las Vegas, they have said that Chris Christie and Donald Trump are the 2 guys really to watch in New Hampshire, that both of them are really gaining momentum, have very strong ground organizations. But Ted Cruz, I rode in the car with him yesterday in Las Vegas. We had an interesting discussion about a number of things. Ted Cruz, and this is going to be in a story that you guys can read on Monday at nationalreview.com, Ted Cruz essentially made the argument that, look, if Marco Rubio wants to be the quote-unquote establishment favorite, if he wants to sort of consolidate that lane of the race while I consolidate the conservative lane of the race, he better win New Hampshire, because historically, certainly in the modern history of the Republican Party, the outsider, the conservative candidate, Ted Cruz in this case, wins Iowa, and he certainly looks like he's going to do that at this point. The establishment favorite, on the other hand, wins New Hampshire, and that's sort of what winnows it down to the two. Marco Rubio is polling third in New Hampshire right now, second in a couple of surveys. He has some serious work to do there, and again, guys like Christie and Bush and Trump, they stand in his way in the state of New Hampshire.
Is Ted Cruz his campaign's strategist-in-chief? Because the sense I get from you of that encounter in the car, driving between events, and all these guys are political animals, make no mistake, but it sounds to me like you're describing someone who gets it at a very deep level.
Senator Cruz has a willingness to discuss the process and the tactics of campaign strategy in a way that I've never seen from another candidate before. His campaign is a very data-heavy operation. They crunch numbers around the clock. And Cruz, not only is he a political animal, but this is a guy who worked on the George W. Bush campaigns along with his wife. He's been involved in politics a very long time. Now, a lot of these guys, they do understand it at that granular level, but they just don't want to talk about it because they feel that it takes them off message.
I want to be the candidate, is what someone
I don't want to be the strategist, exactly. Ted Cruz does not have that problem. He is willing to talk at length about these things on the record. So it makes it very interesting to sort of channel his, you can kind of get a peek inside of his political brain and see how he views these things.
He was the beneficiary, I think we could say, of a recent meeting that you reported on that it was held here locally in Northern Virginia, where some leaders in the social, in the values movement came together and said, we can spread our impact out and our influence will be quite diffuse, or we can unite and potentially have greater impact.
That's exactly right, Bruce. So essentially what this came down to is that you have a handful of very prominent social conservative leaders, chief among them Tony Perkins, the president of the Family Research Council in Washington. And what they have attempted to do over the last 2 years, very quietly around the country, holding meetings with anywhere from 40 to 50 of their fellow activist types. And they have been trying to winnow the field and trying to get to a point where they could unite all of their forces behind a single candidate for exactly the reason you mentioned. They have felt that in the last 2 elections, by splintering their support between various candidates, that they have allowed the establishment favorite, whomever it has been, McCain in 08, Romney in 12, to kind of come right through the middle and build that coalition too easily, and the conservatives never had a chance. Their thinking this time around is if they can coalesce behind one candidate early on, unite the movement behind one candidate, then they will have a very good chance to defeat the establishment favorite. It just so happens that that's the same case that Ted Cruz has been making publicly and privately for the last year, that if you guys can all unite behind my campaign, we will be in a situation that conservatives have never been in the modern history of the party. And suddenly, that always sounded like a pipe dream, Bruce. Suddenly, we're at a point now where it's real and it's concrete and it's actually cementing in front of our very eyes.
The other interesting split-screen moment that I think loomed large and was quite evident to even the casual observer during the debate the other night was the back and forth, and some of it was very sort of junior high school and not relevant to the big picture commander-in-chief test that this whole process is obviously about. But there was some sniping and some back and forth between Donald Trump and Jeb Bush. Does any of that matter? Does any of that move the needle?
It might move the needle. I do think that if you are a Jeb Bush at this point, and he would never say this publicly, but if you're a Jeb Bush at this point, and you are starting to come around to the realization that maybe you can't win this primary race. And of course, if he can't win this primary race, it's a blow not only to him and to his ego, but to the family and to the family legacy. That's a lot for one guy to carry, right? But what's the next best thing? It's probably taking out Donald Trump. If you're going to go down, you'd like to take down Donald Trump with you. And I know for a fact that that is the thinking inside the Jeb Bush camp among some of his senior-most people, that if we can't win, we're sure as heck not going to let that guy win. So I do think that you're going to see an increasingly ugly collision between those two in the weeks ahead.
For personal reasons, because having someone not named Trump as the nominee benefits the party, makes the party nominee more electable in November, or as I suspect, is it a combination of the two?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I do think that Jeb Bush is sort of inseparable from his family's legacy. And his family's legacy has been one of service to the nation, yes, but also to the Republican Party and building the Republican Party all the way back to his grandfather, Prescott Bush. I do think it's very important to sort of look at this through the eyes of a Bush family member. He fears damage to the Republican Party brand that could be lasting. He sees Donald Trump as posing an existential threat, really, to the Republican Party with his talk about women and Hispanics and other minority groups. I think Jeb Bush is going to make it his mission over the next couple of months of this campaign, whether he wins, loses, or draws in some of these early states, to make sure that Donald Trump is not the eventual nominee of the GOP.
If Ted Cruz and perhaps others decide that I'm not going to take a break over the holidays, even though public attention on this race is certain to recede, at least somewhat, and perhaps considerably, if Cruz and others decide I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing because there's no time to waste, and if others are going on vacation, all the more reason for me to continue my outreach and my strategizing and all the rest of it. Does that pull others into a more non-traditional holiday period where this race just barrels through a traditionally slow time?
Unfortunately for the people of Iowa and New Hampshire, I think the answer is yes. I just think that we're at a stage now in campaigning, because of social media, because of the 24-hour news cycle, because of the blogosphere, because of all of it, that these candidates no longer can afford to take even 72 hours off from the trail. I asked Ted Cruz that yesterday, and he said, I think I'm going to have one day. I think they're going to allow me to be home for Christmas with my girls. We're going to have Christmas as a family, open some presents, but then I'm right back to Iowa. So I do think that that's going to sort of have an effect on the rest of the field, because if they're all chasing Ted Cruz and he's at the top and he's not taking a break, then they can't afford to take a break.
One wonders, there are hours of raw footage of Ted Cruz on YouTube that I guess were placed there by his people so that the super PACs with whom they can't legally coordinate could put together these beautiful ads with all the traditional footage we typically see. I wonder how many other people beyond the late night comics are going to be mining some of that footage for, let's say, different purposes.
I can't imagine what they would want to use it for.
Tim Alberta, Chief Political Correspondent for National Review. Tim, thanks for being here as always. Great stuff. Have a great holiday. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Bruce.
We appreciate your being here. We'll take a quick break here. When we return, the head of the Montgomery County Council, Nancy Fleury.